Pack your bags and get out, my daughter-in-law Vanessa snarled, her manicured finger pointing toward the door like a weapon. We're done pretending you're welcome here. The words hit me like ice water on a July morning, especially coming from someone living in the house I'd bought and paid for. What happened next changed everything, not just for me, but for the ungrateful family who thought they could discard me like yesterday's newspaper. I came back 3 weeks later, but I wasn't alone, and what I brought with me would shake their perfect little world to its foundation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in Millbrook, Ohio. I was in my small bedroom at the back of the house, folding laundry that included my son Marcus's work shirts and Vanessa's expensive yoga clothes. The routine had become second nature over the past year since I'd moved in with them. Wake up at 6, make coffee, start breakfast, handle whatever household tasks needed doing while they slept in until 8. It wasn't the retirement I'd imagined, but after Richard passed away and left me with more medical bills than savings, this arrangement had seemed like a blessing. The house on Maple Grove Drive was a 3-bedroom colonial that I'd helped them purchase 2 years earlier. When Marcus had come to me with the real estate listing, eyes bright with hope and anxiety, I'd written the down payment check without hesitation. $62,000 from my retirement fund, money that had taken decades to accumulate. But seeing my only child's dream home within reach had made the sacrifice feel worthwhile. Family comes first, I'd always believed. That morning, as I smoothed wrinkles from Marcus's blue dress shirt, I still believed it. The house had good bones, as the realtor had said. Hardwood floors that gleamed when properly maintained, a kitchen with granite countertops that I cleaned daily, and a living room with bay windows that caught the morning light beautifully. I'd also contributed another $15,000 for the new appliances Vanessa insisted they needed. The stainless steel refrigerator, the gas range with 6 burners, the dishwasher that ran whisper quiet. All purchased because I wanted my son and his wife to have nice things, to build the kind of life Richard and I had dreamed of but never quite achieved. I was arranging Marcus's shirts by color when Vanessa's voice echoed through the house, sharp and impatient. "Elena, where's my blue blazer? I have that presentation today, and if you shrunk it in the wash again, I swear to God." The accusation stung because I'd never shrunk anything. I was methodical about laundry, checking labels, using appropriate temperatures, treating stains with the care of someone who understands the value of expensive clothing. But Vanessa's default assumption was always that I'd made a mistake. I found the blazer hanging in her closet, exactly where it belonged, still in the dry cleaning bag from when I'd picked it up 3 days earlier. Another small expense I'd covered without being asked, along with Marcus's suits and Vanessa's collection of work clothes that required professional cleaning. The monthly dry cleaning bill averaged $200, money that came from my Social Security check because they were still paying off Marcus's student loans from law school. "It's in your closet, dear," I called out, keeping my voice pleasant. "Third hanger from the left, still in the cleaning bag." The response was silence, followed by the sound of hangers rattling aggressively as she confirmed what I told her. No apology, no acknowledgement of the accusation, just the expectation that I would continue managing these details without complaint or recognition. Breakfast was already on the table when they came downstairs. Fresh fruit salad with strawberries from the farmer's market, scrambled eggs made with the expensive organic butter Vanessa preferred, whole grain toast cut diagonally because Marcus liked it that way, and coffee brewed strong enough to power a small city. The morning newspaper was folded beside Marcus's plate, opened to the business section where he always started reading. "Morning, Mom," Marcus mumbled, barely glancing up as he reached for his coffee mug. He was 34 years old, handsome in the way Richard had been at that age, with dark hair that was just beginning to show gray at the temples and brown eyes that used to light up when he saw me. Lately, those eyes seemed to look through me rather than at me, as if I'd become part of the household furniture. Vanessa swept into the kitchen wearing the blue blazer I'd located, her blonde hair perfectly styled and her makeup applied with the precision of someone who understood the importance of appearance in corporate America. She was beautiful in a cold way, like a sculpture that demanded admiration from a distance. In the 3 years since she'd married my son, I'd tried repeatedly to build a connection with her, but every attempt had been met with polite indifference or barely concealed irritation. "The presentation is at 10, she announced, picking at the fruit salad while checking her phone. "Marcus, did you confirm the dinner reservation for tonight? The Hendersons are expecting us at 8, and you know how Margaret gets when people are late." She spoke around me as if I weren't there, addressing my son while I stood at the counter refilling their coffee cups like hired help. "All set," Marcus replied, still buried in his newspaper. "Sterling Steakhouse, 8 o'clock sharp." The restaurant name made my stomach tighten slightly. Sterling's was the most expensive place in town, the kind of establishment where dinner for two could easily cost $300. It was also the restaurant where they'd celebrated their anniversary the month before and where they'd taken Marcus's colleagues for his promotion celebration. All meals that had appeared on the credit card statement I helped pay every month. I'd never been invited to join them at Sterling's or any of their other dinner outings. When they entertained Marcus's colleagues or Vanessa's work friends, I was expected to make myself scarce, either staying in my room or finding somewhere else to be for the evening. The message was clear without being spoken. I was suitable for managing their household, but not for representing their social life. The memory of last month's credit card statement flickered through my mind as I watched them eat breakfast. $400 at Sterling's, $200 at the wine bar downtown, $150 at that trendy brunch place Vanessa liked. Meanwhile, I'd been stretching my grocery budget to accommodate their preferences for organic produce, grass-fed beef, and imported cheese. The financial math was becoming increasingly challenging, but every time I considered bringing it up, I remembered Marcus's stress about the mortgage payments and Vanessa's complaints about their tight budget. "I'll be late tonight," Vanessa continued, not looking up from her phone. "The Henderson dinner might run long, and then we're meeting some of Marcus's law school friends for drinks. Don't wait up." The casual dismissal was delivered while she was typing, multitasking my irrelevance into her busy schedule. "Of course, dear. I'll leave the porch light on." The words came automatically, the same response I'd given dozens of times before. They would come home after midnight, probably spending more money in one evening than I spent in a month, while I waited in my small room reading library books and listening for the sound of their car in the driveway. After they left for work, I began my daily routine of maintaining their household. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Loading the dishwasher with their breakfast dishes, wiping down counters that were already clean, starting a load of laundry that mostly consisted of their clothes. The house felt different when they were gone, more peaceful but also more empty. I could move through the rooms without feeling like an intruder in a space that was theoretically my home too. The living room required dusting, a task that involved carefully moving Vanessa's collection of decorative objects and framed photographs. Most of the pictures featured the two of them at various events. Vacations to places like Napa Valley and Charleston, their wedding day with its $1,000 photographer and designer flowers. There were a few photos that included me, mostly from holidays where my presence had been tolerated rather than welcomed, but the majority of their displayed memories existed in a world where I didn't belong. I was polishing the glass coffee table when the mail arrived, sliding through the slot with a soft thud. Bills, mostly, along with catalogs for expensive home goods and investment opportunities. The routine had become familiar over the past year. I would sort everything into piles, open the bills, and calculate what portion needed to come from my rapidly dwindling savings account versus their combined income that never seemed sufficient for their lifestyle. The credit card statement was thicker than usual, multiple pages of charges that made my stomach sink as I read through them. The Henderson dinner they were attending tonight had already been paid for in advance, a $120 deposit. There were charges from clothing stores, electronics retailers, subscription services I didn't recognize, and restaurants where they'd eaten lunch during workdays. The total balance was over $8,000, with a minimum payment due that exceeded my monthly Social Security check. I sat at the kitchen table with a calculator and a notebook, the same ritual I'd been performing monthly for the past year. My contribution to the household had started as temporary help with groceries and utilities, maybe $200 a month while they got established in their new home. But temporary had evolved into permanent, and $200 had grown to cover an increasing percentage of their living expenses. The down payment I'd provided had been just the beginning. There had been the emergency car repair when Marcus's BMW needed a new transmission, $3,000 that I'd transferred from my retirement account because they couldn't afford the expense and still make their mortgage payment. The kitchen renovation Vanessa had insisted was necessary for entertaining, another $12,000 that I'd covered when their home equity loan hadn't been approved for the full amount. The vacation to Hawaii that had been Marcus's birthday present to himself, funded by my credit card when their savings account came up short. Each expense had been presented as a one-time necessity, a temporary shortfall that would be repaid once their financial situation improved. Marcus had gotten a promotion 6 months ago, and Vanessa had changed jobs for a significant salary increase. But somehow there was never money available to start paying me back. Instead, there were new expenses that required my assistance, new emergencies that demanded immediate financial intervention. The notebook contained careful records of every dollar I'd contributed over the past 2 years. The down payment, the appliances, the repairs, the renovations, the credit card balances, the monthly expenses I'd gradually absorbed. The total was approaching $140,000, money that represented decades of careful saving and the entire inheritance Richard had left me. What had started as helping my son achieve his dreams had evolved into subsidizing a lifestyle I could no longer afford to maintain. My phone rang while I was reviewing the calculations, the caller ID showing the name of my oldest friend, Patricia Williams. We'd worked together for 30 years at the county courthouse, sharing lunch breaks and life's ups and downs until our retirement. Her voice was warm and familiar, a reminder of the world that existed beyond this house and its complicated dynamics. "Elena, honey, how are you? I haven't heard from you in weeks." The concern in her voice was genuine, the kind of friendship that notices absence and cares enough to check in. "Are you still coming to book club Thursday? Margaret picked that romance novel you recommended, and we're all curious to hear what you thought." The book club had been a monthly tradition for 5 years, a gathering of women who'd shared careers and now shared retirement. I'd been missing meetings more frequently lately, partly because Thursday evenings were when Marcus and Vanessa often had social commitments that required me to be available for household management, and partly because I felt increasingly disconnected from conversations about travel plans and grandchildren visits that required financial resources I no longer had. "I'm not sure about Thursday," I admitted, glancing at the credit card statement spread across the table. "Things have been busy here, and you know how it is with family." The excuse sounded weak even to me, but explaining the reality of my situation felt too complicated and too embarrassing. How do you tell your successful, independent friends that you've become a live-in domestic worker for your own son? "Elena, you sound tired. Are you sure everything is all right?" Patricia's intuition had always been sharp, honed by years of reading between the lines in legal documents and human behavior. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right? We've been friends too long for polite evasion." The kindness in her voice nearly broke my resolve to keep family matters private. For a moment, I considered telling her everything. The financial arrangements that had spiraled beyond my control, the daily reminders that I was a burden rather than a blessing. But the words stuck in my throat, held back by maternal loyalty and the fear that speaking the truth would make it more real. "I'm fine, really, just adjusting to living with kids again. You know how it is." The lie came easily, practiced for months of deflecting similar questions from other friends who'd noticed my withdrawal from activities and social commitments. "Maybe next month I'll be more settled into the routine." We chatted for a few more minutes about her grandchildren and the church renovation project she was coordinating, normal conversations between retired women who had the luxury of choosing how to spend their time and money. After hanging up, I sat in the quiet kitchen surrounded by evidence of my financial sacrifice and emotional isolation, wondering when helping my family had stopped feeling like love and started feeling like imprisonment. The afternoon passed in familiar routines, grocery shopping with a carefully planned list that maximized nutrition while minimizing cost, selecting generic brands and sale items while mentally calculating the impact on my shrinking budget. The checkout total was $163, money that would feed a household of 3 for a week if everyone was willing to eat simply and avoid expensive conveniences. But Vanessa preferred organic everything, and Marcus had developed a taste for imported beer and artisanal cheese, preferences that doubled the grocery bill without doubling the satisfaction. I was putting away groceries when Marcus arrived home, his expression tighter than usual and his shoulders carrying the kind of tension that suggested workplace stress. He loosened his tie and grabbed a beer from the refrigerator, drinking deeply before acknowledging my presence in the kitchen where I was preparing dinner. "Rough day?" I asked, genuinely concerned about the son who still looked like the little boy who used to tell me about playground adventures and classroom victories. Despite everything that had changed between us, my maternal instincts remained intact, programmed to offer comfort and support whenever he seemed troubled. "Partner meeting didn't go well," he admitted, slumping against the counter in a posture that made him look younger and more vulnerable. "They're making noises about billable hours and client development. Apparently, my numbers aren't impressive enough for the senior partners." The worry in his voice was real, a reminder that beneath his adult success and expensive lifestyle, he was still someone who needed encouragement and reassurance. "You're a good lawyer, Marcus. You work hard and you care about your clients. That has to count for something." The words came from the place where I'd stored 34 years of maternal pride and protective love. Even when our relationship felt strained, I wanted him to succeed and be happy. That desire hadn't changed, even though the cost of supporting it was draining my resources and my spirit. "Thanks, Mom. I know you believe in me." He smiled briefly, a flash of the warmth that used to define our relationship. "Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choices, you know? The mortgage, the car payments, trying to keep up with everyone else's lifestyle. It feels like we're always one crisis away from financial disaster." The irony was bitter and sharp. He worried about financial disaster while I was actively preventing it with my dwindling savings and increasing debt. "Thanks, Mom. I know you believe in me." He smiled briefly, a flash of the warmth that used to define our relationship. "Sometimes I wonder if I made the right choices, you know? The mortgage, the car payments, trying to keep up with everyone else's lifestyle. It feels like we're always one crisis away from financial disaster." The irony was bitter and sharp. He worried about financial disaster while I was actively preventing it with my dwindling savings and increasing debt. The mortgage payments he stressed about were manageable because I contributed to monthly expenses. The car payments that concerned him were affordable because I covered insurance and maintenance costs. The lifestyle he questioned was sustainable only because I'd made it sustainable through my financial sacrifice. "Money pressures are temporary," I said carefully, not wanting to burden him with my own concerns while he was dealing with work stress. "You and Vanessa are both smart and capable. Things will work out." The reassurance felt hollow even as I spoke it, but maternal instinct overrode personal honesty. Protecting his emotional well-being had become automatic, even when it meant hiding my own struggles. Vanessa arrived home while I was setting the table, her mood bright and energetic in contrast to Marcus's subdued demeanor. She'd had a successful presentation and was riding the high of professional accomplishment, talking rapidly about client reactions and potential contract extensions while she changed clothes for their dinner out. "The Hendersons are going to be so impressed with the proposal," she continued, emerging from their bedroom in a black dress that had cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "Margaret mentioned that her husband's company is looking for new legal representation, so tonight could be really important for Marcus's career development." The dinner suddenly had higher stakes than simple social obligation. It was a business opportunity disguised as friendship, the kind of networking event that could justify its expense if it led to new clients for Marcus's firm. I understood the calculation, even as I recognized that the cost of the evening would eventually appear on the credit card statement I'd help pay next month. "That sounds promising," I offered, genuinely hoping that something positive would come from their investment in expensive restaurant meals and social networking. "Should I wait up to hear how it goes?" The question was partly maternal curiosity and partly practical concern about whether they'd need anything when they returned home. "Don't bother," Vanessa replied, checking her reflection in the hall mirror and adjusting her jewelry with the precision of someone who understood the importance of appearance. "We'll probably be late, and I have an early meeting tomorrow. Just make sure the coffee pot is ready to go." The instruction was delivered casually, part of the routine of domestic management that I'd gradually absorbed without formal discussion or acknowledgement. They left in a cloud of expensive perfume and cologne, their conversation already shifting to topics I wasn't privy to and plans I wasn't included in. The house settled into its evening quiet, and I cleaned up the dinner dishes they'd been too rushed to eat, saving their portions in containers that would probably become my lunch tomorrow. The evening stretched ahead with familiar emptiness. I could read, or watch television, or call Patricia back to confirm my attendance at Thursday's book club meeting. But the weight of the afternoon's financial calculations pressed against my chest like a physical burden. The numbers in my notebook told a story of generosity that had transformed into unsustainable sacrifice, and for the first time, I allowed myself to acknowledge what I'd been avoiding for months. I was running out of money, running out of options, and running out of the emotional resilience required to maintain a living situation that diminished my dignity while depleting my resources. The house around me felt like a beautiful prison, comfortable and well-appointed, but fundamentally constraining. I'd helped create this environment, contributed to its purchase and maintenance, but my presence here was tolerated rather than celebrated. The realization crystallized slowly, like morning frost forming on windows. I'd been thinking of this arrangement as temporary, a phase that would improve once Marcus and Vanessa were more financially stable. But their expenses had grown alongside their income, and their dependence on my contributions had become built into their lifestyle rather than being eliminated by their success. The emergency financial help had evolved into permanent subsidy, and the temporary living arrangement had become indefinite dependency. I sat at the kitchen table with my notebook and calculator, looking at the evidence of my diminishing financial security with new clarity. The pattern was unsustainable, the trajectory was clear, and the outcome was predictable if nothing changed. Within 6 months, maybe less, I would exhaust my remaining savings and retirement accounts. The Social Security income I received wasn't sufficient to maintain their lifestyle expectations, and there was no indication that they were prepared to reduce their expenses to match their actual income. The house creaked softly around me, settling into its nighttime rhythm while I contemplated a future that looked increasingly different from what I'd imagined when I'd agreed to this living arrangement. Outside, neighbors were arriving home from their own dinner plans and social commitments, ordinary people living ordinary lives without the complicated dynamics of financial enmeshment and emotional obligation that defined my daily existence. I was still sitting at the table when they returned home after midnight, their voices carrying through the quiet house as they discussed the evening's conversations and potential opportunities. Marcus sounded more optimistic than he had earlier, suggesting that Vanessa's prediction about networking possibilities had been accurate. Their footsteps on the stairs were careful, but not silent, the considerate movement of people trying not to wake someone they assumed was sleeping. But I wasn't sleeping. I was calculating and thinking, and finally acknowledging what I'd been avoiding for months. The life I was living wasn't sustainable, financially, emotionally, or spiritually. The relationship with my son had been reduced to a series of transactions rather than expressions of love. The marriage I was supporting through my financial contributions wasn't strengthened by my presence, but was enabled by it in ways that prevented real growth and independence. The notebook closed, with a soft sound that seemed to echo through the empty kitchen. Tomorrow would bring another day of the same routine, the same expectations, the same gradual erosion of my resources and self-respect. But tonight, for the first time in months, I allowed myself to consider what might happen if I stopped enabling their lifestyle and started protecting my own future. The thought was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. The next morning began like countless others, with the soft buzz of my alarm clock pulling me from restless dreams into the gray light of dawn. I moved through the familiar routine of making coffee and starting breakfast while Marcus and Vanessa slept in their comfortable bedroom with its king-size mattress and blackout curtains. The kitchen was quiet, except for the gentle sizzle of eggs in the pan and the percolating sound of coffee brewing strong enough to fuel another day of maintaining their household. But something had shifted overnight. The calculations from the previous evening had settled into my consciousness like sediment in still water, creating a foundation of clarity I'd been lacking for months. The numbers didn't lie, and the trajectory was undeniable. I was subsidizing a lifestyle that was draining my resources while diminishing my dignity, and the arrangement was benefiting everyone except me. Marcus appeared first, hair rumpled and eyes still heavy with sleep, reaching for his coffee mug with the automatic movement of someone following a deeply ingrained routine. He mumbled a greeting that might have been morning or might have been something else, but his attention was already focused on his phone, scrolling through emails and text messages that had accumulated overnight. "How was dinner?" I asked, setting his plate in front of him with the same care I'd been providing for the past year. The eggs were cooked exactly as he liked them, slightly runny in the center, with toast cut diagonally and fresh fruit arranged in a small bowl. The presentation was worthy of a restaurant, an attention to detail that came from decades of maternal love and domestic pride. "Good," he replied without looking up from his screen. "Henderson's husband might have some work for the firm. Vanessa made a good impression." The information was delivered absently, as if my question had been a minor interruption in his digital communication rather than genuine interest in his life and career. Vanessa entered the kitchen wearing a silk robe that had cost more than my monthly utility contribution, her hair perfectly styled despite having just woken up. She moved with the confidence of someone who expected the world to accommodate her needs, pouring coffee into her favorite mug while scanning the breakfast I'd prepared with the critical eye of someone evaluating a service. "The eggs look good today," she commented, a backhanded compliment that acknowledged my effort while implying that previous attempts had been substandard. "Did you remember to get those organic strawberries I mentioned? The regular ones taste like water, and I have that client lunch today where presentation matters." The strawberries in question had cost $12 for a small container, premium produce that represented a significant portion of my grocery budget for fresh fruit. I'd bought them because Vanessa had mentioned preferring them, adding them to a shopping list that already stretched my weekly food allowance. The client lunch she referenced would likely be charged to the company credit card I helped pay each month, another expense that would appear on next month's statement. "Yes, they're in the fruit salad," I confirmed, watching her select only the expensive strawberries while leaving the less costly grapes and apple slices untouched. The waste was typical, a casual disregard for the cost and effort involved in providing options she could afford to be selective about. The morning continued with familiar rhythms. Marcus left for work first, grabbing the lunch I'd packed along with his briefcase and travel mug of coffee. Vanessa followed 30 minutes later, her departure preceded by a final check of her appearance in the hall mirror and a last-minute review of documents I'd organized for her presentation. Neither thanked me for the breakfast preparation, lunch packing, or household management that enabled their smooth transition from sleep to work. After they left, I began the daily tasks of maintaining their home. Loading the dishwasher with plates that still held remnants of expensive organic produce, wiping counters that were already clean, sorting mail that consisted largely of bills I would help pay and catalogs for luxury goods they couldn't afford without my assistance. The routine had become automatic, but this morning each task felt different, weighted with the knowledge that my resources were finite and rapidly diminishing. The house phone rang while I was starting a load of laundry that consisted primarily of their clothes. The caller was Marcus's law school friend David, someone I'd met briefly at their wedding but hadn't spoken with since. His voice was friendly but carried an undertone of concern that immediately put me on alert. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. I've been trying to reach Marcus, but his office says he's in meetings all day." David's professional tone suggested this wasn't a social call, and the formal use of my married name rather than the casual familiarity of friendship indicated serious business. "He left for work about an hour ago," I replied, wondering why David would be calling the house number instead of Marcus's cell phone. "Is there something I can help you with, or would you prefer to leave a message?" The pause that followed was long enough to make me uncomfortable, filled with the kind of hesitation that preceded difficult conversations. "Actually, Mrs. Rodriguez, I was hoping to speak with you directly. I've been handling some legal work for a client who's interested in properties in your neighborhood. When I mentioned that Marcus lived on Maple Grove Drive, they expressed specific interest in his house." The words took a moment to register, their implications settling slowly into my consciousness like stones dropping through water. David's client was interested in purchasing the house I was sitting in, the home I'd helped Marcus and Vanessa buy with my down payment and continued to maintain with my financial contributions. "I don't understand," I said carefully, moving to the kitchen table where my financial notebook still lay open from the previous evening's calculations. "Marcus and Vanessa aren't selling. They just bought this place 2 years ago." "Right, I know this is unusual," David continued, his lawyer's training evident in the way he navigated what was clearly delicate territory. "But my client is prepared to make an offer significantly above market value. The neighborhood is exactly what they're looking for, and this particular house meets all their requirements. I thought it might be worth mentioning to Marcus, even if they're not actively considering selling." The conversation continued for several minutes, with David explaining that his client was relocating from California and needed to purchase quickly, that they were prepared to pay cash and close within 30 days, that the offer would likely be substantial enough to pay off the existing mortgage with significant profit remaining. As he spoke, I found myself taking notes in the margin of my financial notebook, recording details that might be important later. After hanging up, I sat in the quiet kitchen processing what David had told me. The house that represented Marcus and Vanessa's stability and my substantial financial investment was suddenly valuable in ways that could change everyone's situation. A cash offer above market value would eliminate their mortgage debt, provide them with capital to purchase something more appropriate to their actual income, and potentially return some of the money I'd invested in their home ownership dream. But there was something else, a possibility that had formed in my mind during David's explanation and was now growing larger with each passing moment. If the house was valuable enough to attract serious buyers willing to pay premium prices, and if that house existed because of my down payment and continued financial support, then perhaps I had more options than I'd realized the night before. The thought was radical and frightening and completely contrary to everything I'd believed about family loyalty and maternal sacrifice. I spent the rest of the morning researching property values in the neighborhood, using the internet I paid for to access real estate websites that confirmed David's suggestion about market conditions. Similar houses had sold recently for prices that exceeded what Marcus and Vanessa owed on their mortgage by substantial amounts. The equity in the house was significant, built not just through market appreciation, but through the down payment I'd provided and the monthly contributions that had prevented them from struggling with mortgage payments. The afternoon brought its usual routines with unusual undercurrents. I prepared dinner while considering conversations I'd never imagined having. I folded laundry while calculating financial scenarios that had seemed impossible that morning. I organized their mail while thinking about legal concepts like property ownership and financial contribution that I'd never needed to understand before. Marcus arrived home in a better mood than he'd shown in weeks, his step lighter and his expression more relaxed than it had been during recent evenings of work stress and financial pressure. He accepted the beer I offered with a genuine smile and actually made eye contact when he thanked me, small gestures that reminded me of the son I'd raised and the relationship we'd once shared. "Good day?" I asked, genuinely curious about what had improved his mood so dramatically since morning. "Great day, actually." That Henderson connection Vanessa made at dinner paid off. Richard Henderson's company wants to interview our firm for a major contract, something that could bring in serious revenue over the next 2 years. The excitement in his voice was infectious, a reminder of his passion for his work when it wasn't overshadowed by financial stress and professional insecurity. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. You work so hard, and you deserve recognition for your talent and dedication." The pride I felt was genuine, uncomplicated by the financial dynamics that had strained our relationship. Success in his career would benefit everyone, potentially reducing his dependence on my contributions while restoring his confidence and professional standing. Vanessa arrived home equally energetic, her presentation having exceeded client expectations and resulted in a contract extension that would secure her position for the next 18 months. The combination of their professional victories created a celebratory atmosphere that felt different from the usual evening tension over bills and budgets. "We should go out to dinner," Vanessa announced, already mentally planning an evening that would undoubtedly involve expensive wine and restaurant bills that would appear on next month's credit card statement. Sterling's has that seafood special on Wednesdays, and we have so much to celebrate. The suggestion was delivered with the assumption that celebration meant spending money they didn't have on experiences I wouldn't be invited to share. But this evening, instead of feeling excluded and resentful, I found myself calculating the cost of their dinner plans against the property values I'd researched that afternoon. Actually, I said carefully, the words feeling strange in my mouth, I had an interesting call today. David Chen called looking for Marcus, but we ended up talking about the house. Apparently, he has a client interested in buying properties in this neighborhood. The shift in the room's energy was immediate and dramatic. Marcus's celebration dimmed as he processed what I'd said, while Vanessa's expression moved quickly through confusion, surprise, and something that looked like panic. "Buying properties?" Marcus repeated, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone trying to understand implications. "What kind of client? We're not selling." I explained David's call in detail, watching their reactions as I described the cash offer, the above-market value price, and the 30-day closing timeline. Marcus listened with the professional attention he brought to legal matters, while Vanessa's responses were more emotional, her body language becoming increasingly agitated as she realized someone was discussing their home as if it were a commodity rather than their personal sanctuary. "We can't sell," Vanessa stated firmly, her voice rising with each word. "This is our home. We just finished the kitchen renovation, and I finally have the closet organized exactly how I want it. Besides, where would we live? Do you know how expensive rent is in this area?" The questions revealed her assumption that their current lifestyle was permanently sustainable, that the financial arrangements supporting their home ownership were indefinitely reliable. She spoke as if the kitchen renovation I'd funded and the closet organization I'd helped implement were permanent investments rather than temporary accommodations dependent on my continued financial sacrifice. "Nobody's suggesting we sell," Marcus said quickly, but his tone suggested he was considering possibilities he hadn't previously contemplated. "It's just interesting that someone would make an unsolicited offer. David wouldn't call unless the client was serious and the price was substantial." The conversation continued through dinner, with Marcus asking increasingly detailed questions about David's client, while Vanessa insisted that selling was absolutely out of the question regardless of price. As they debated, I found myself listening with detached interest, as if their discussion concerned strangers rather than my own living situation and financial investment. But later that evening, after they'd retired to their bedroom to continue conversations I wasn't included in, I sat at the kitchen table with my notebook and calculator, adding new numbers to my existing calculations. The house that represented my financial sacrifice was also my potential liberation, if I could find the courage to pursue options I'd never previously contemplated. The thought that had begun forming during David's phone call was crystallizing into something more concrete and more radical than anything I'd contemplated before. The house existed because of my contribution, was maintained through my ongoing financial support, and represented equity that could secure my future independence if properly accessed. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to imagine a different life, one where my generosity was appreciated rather than expected, where my presence was welcomed rather than tolerated, and where my financial resources supported my own security rather than someone else's lifestyle. The notebook closed with the soft sound of a decision being made, even though I wasn't yet ready to acknowledge what that decision might require. 3 days later, I was scrubbing the guest bathroom that had somehow become exclusively mine when Vanessa's voice cut through the house like a blade through silk. "Elena! Elena, get down here right now!" The urgency in her tone was different from her usual impatience, sharper and more demanding, carrying an edge that my stomach clenched with familiar dread. I found them both in the living room, Vanessa pacing back and forth, while Marcus sat on the sofa with his laptop open, his face pale and tense. Between them on the coffee table were scattered papers that I recognized as bank statements, credit card bills, and what looked like a real estate market analysis. The scene had the feeling of an intervention or an interrogation, with me cast as the unwilling subject. "Sit down," Vanessa commanded, pointing to the chair across from where Marcus sat. Her tone was the one she used with subordinates at her office, professional but dismissive, assuming compliance without question. "We need to talk about this house situation, and we need to talk about it right now." I remained standing, a small act of defiance that felt surprisingly empowering. The chair Vanessa had pointed to represented submission, an acceptance of whatever judgment they'd prepared during their private deliberations. Instead, I crossed my arms and waited for them to explain why they'd summoned me like a defendant called before a tribunal. "We know what you're trying to do," Vanessa began, her voice tight with accusation. "David Chen called Marcus yesterday, and suddenly you're having mysterious conversations about selling our house. Do you think we're stupid? Do you think we can't see what's happening here?" The attack was swift and direct, designed to put me on the defensive before I could mount any resistance to whatever conclusions they'd reached. Marcus looked uncomfortable, but didn't interrupt his wife's aggressive questioning, his silence serving as tacit approval of her confrontational approach. "I don't know what you think is happening," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. "David called here looking for Marcus. I told you about the conversation the same day it happened. There's nothing mysterious about it." "Nothing mysterious?" Vanessa's laugh was harsh and bitter. "You've been acting strange for days, secretive phone calls, researching property values on the computer, asking weird questions about the mortgage payments, and now suddenly there's a buyer interested in our house at exactly the moment you're having some kind of financial crisis." The accusation hung in the air between us, sharp and precise in its implications. They'd been watching me more carefully than I'd realized, monitoring my behavior and drawing connections I hadn't known were visible. The research I'd thought was private had been observed. The phone calls I'd believed were discreet had been noted, and my attempts to understand our financial situation had been interpreted as evidence of betrayal. "What financial crisis?" I asked, though my heart was already sinking as I anticipated their response. The question was partly genuine curiosity about what they knew and partly a desperate hope that their assumptions were wrong. Marcus finally spoke, his voice carrying the measured tone he used for difficult legal discussions. "Mom, we've been looking at the household finances more carefully since David's call. The credit card balances, the monthly expenses you've been covering, the way the bills are distributed between our income and yours." He paused, studying my face as if searching for confirmation of their suspicions. "You're running out of money, aren't you?" The directness of the question was like a physical blow. All the careful management I'd done to hide my financial strain from them, all the strategic maneuvering to maintain their lifestyle while protecting their feelings, had been rendered meaningless by their decision to actually examine our shared expenses. They knew the truth I'd been protecting them from, and their response was suspicion rather than gratitude or concern. "I've been managing," I said carefully, not wanting to lie outright but not ready to admit the full scope of my financial depletion. Retirement budgeting is always challenging, and helping family requires careful planning. "Managing?" Vanessa's voice rose to a pitch that would have been audible throughout the house. "Elena, you've spent over $100,000 on us in the past 2 years. Your retirement accounts are nearly empty, your credit cards are maxed out, and your Social Security barely covers the monthly expenses you've taken on. That's not managing, that's financial suicide." The precision of her knowledge was shocking. They hadn't just glanced at household bills. They'd conducted a thorough investigation of my financial situation, accessing information I'd tried to keep private and drawing conclusions about my resources and expenditures that were painfully accurate. The violation of privacy was as disturbing as the accuracy of their assessment. "And now," Marcus continued, his lawyer's training evident in how he built his case, "a mysterious buyer appears offering cash above market value, and you're suddenly very interested in property values and quick sales. It doesn't take a genius to connect those dots." The implication was clear and deeply offensive. They believed I was orchestrating the sale of their home to solve my financial problems, that I was betraying their trust and security for my own benefit. The accusation ignored every sacrifice I'd made for their welfare, every dollar I'd contributed to their lifestyle, every comfort I'd foregone to ensure their happiness. "You think I'm trying to force you to sell your house?" I said, the words carrying more hurt than I'd intended to reveal. "You think I would manipulate your living situation for money? Wouldn't you? Vanessa stepped closer, her eyes bright with anger and what looked like genuine fear. You've invested everything you have in this house and our lifestyle. Now that you're broke, the only way to get your money back is to force a sale that would give you some return on your investment. The financial logic was sound, which made the accusation even more painful. From their perspective, my behavior could be interpreted as exactly the kind of desperate maneuvering they described. The timing of David's call with my growing financial pressure created a narrative that seemed plausible, even though it was completely wrong. "Is that what you think of me?" I asked, looking directly at Marcus. "After everything I've done, every way I've supported you both, you think I would sabotage your home for money?" Marcus had the grace to look uncomfortable, but he didn't contradict Vanessa's theory or defend my character against her accusations. His silence was more damning than her words, suggesting that he shared her suspicions, even if he was less willing to voice them directly. "I think you're desperate," Vanessa answered when Marcus remained quiet. "And desperate people do desperate things. You've been living beyond your means to support our lifestyle, and now that reality is catching up, you're looking for ways to recover your losses." The conversation was spiraling beyond anything I'd anticipated when I told them about David's call. What had seemed like interesting information about property values had transformed into evidence of betrayal, and my financial contributions had been reframed as investments requiring return rather than gifts given from love. "I see," I said quietly, the pieces of their worldview finally clicking into place. "So my help over the past 2 years wasn't family support. It was investment in property I don't own, contributing to a lifestyle I'm not truly part of, funding dreams that don't include me except as a financial resource." The accuracy of my summary seemed to surprise them, as if they hadn't fully articulated their own thinking until I reflected it back to them. Marcus looked genuinely uncomfortable now, perhaps recognizing the coldness of the perspective they'd revealed, while Vanessa maintained her defensive posture. "That's not what we meant," Marcus said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "We appreciate everything you've done, Mom, but you have to understand how this looks from our perspective. The timing is suspicious, and we can't afford to lose this house." "You can't afford to lose this house?" I repeated, tasting the bitter irony of his words. "The house I helped you buy, in the neighborhood where I have no friends, supporting a lifestyle I'm not invited to share, while spending money I can't afford to lose." The truth of what I'd said settled over the room like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering for months. They'd built their security on my sacrifice, their comfort on my contributions, their future on my resources, but they'd never considered what that arrangement meant for my own well-being or autonomy. "Elena, we're grateful for your help," Vanessa said, her tone shifting towards something that might have been conciliation if it hadn't been so obviously strategic. "Threats to your housing security?" The phrase was so absurd that I almost laughed. "Vanessa, I am your housing security. Without my down payment, you couldn't have bought this house. Without my monthly contributions, you couldn't afford the mortgage payments. Without my credit cards, you couldn't maintain your lifestyle. I'm not threatening your security, I am your security." The statement hung in the air with the force of undeniable truth. Marcus's face went pale as he processed the implications of what I'd said, while Vanessa's expression shifted through several emotions before settling on something that looked like panic. "That's exactly what I'm talking about," she said, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. "You're holding your financial contributions over our heads like weapons, threatening to withdraw support unless we comply with your demands." "What demands?" I asked, genuinely confused by her characterization of our conversation. "I haven't made any demands. I told you about a phone call from David, and somehow that became evidence that I'm manipulating your living situation." "The demand is obvious," Marcus said, though he didn't sound convinced by his own words. "Sell the house so you can recover your investment and solve your financial problems." The interpretation was so contrary to my actual intentions that it took me several seconds to formulate a response. I'd never suggested they should sell, never indicated that I wanted them to consider David's client, never even implied that their housing decisions should be influenced by my financial situation. Marcus, I have never asked you to sell this house. I have never suggested that you should consider any offers. I told you about David's call because it seemed like information you should have, not because I wanted you to act on it. Then why the research? Vanessa demanded. Why were you looking up property values and comparable sales if you weren't planning something? The question revealed how completely they'd misunderstood my behavior and motivations. The research I'd done was part of trying to understand my own financial situation, not part of plotting to change theirs. But explaining that would require admitting the full extent of my financial depletion, something I wasn't ready to do while under attack. I was trying to understand what I'd invested in, I said carefully. When you're spending money you can't afford to lose, it's natural to want to know the value of what you're supporting. See? Vanessa turned to Marcus with triumph in her voice. She just admitted it. Investment, value, supporting. She's been treating our home like a business transaction, and now she wants a return on her investment. The twisted interpretation of my words was maddening in its illogic, but I could see that Marcus was being convinced by his wife's argument. The narrative she'd constructed painted me as a calculating manipulator rather than a generous mother, and once that frame was established, everything I said could be reinterpreted as evidence supporting her theory. I don't want a return on investment, I said firmly. I want my son to be happy and successful. I want my daughter-in-law to feel secure and comfortable. I want this family to thrive. That's why I've contributed everything I have to making your dreams possible. Then prove it, Vanessa said, her voice carrying the tone of someone delivering an ultimatum. Call David back and tell him his client needs to look elsewhere. Make it clear that this house is not for sale at any price and that you're not interested in any offers or discussions about property values. The demand was presented as a test of loyalty, but it felt more like a trap designed to force me into a position where my only choice was compliance or confirmation of their accusations. If I refused to call David, it would be interpreted as proof that I was manipulating the situation. If I agreed to call him, it would establish their right to control my communications and decisions. I'll call David, I said finally, not because I agreed with their interpretation, but because the battle wasn't worth fighting when the war was already lost. I'll tell him that you're not interested in selling. Good, Vanessa said, but her satisfaction seemed premature, as if she'd won a victory without understanding what she'd actually accomplished. And Elena, I think it's time we had an honest conversation about the financial arrangements around here. The phrase sent a chill through my chest because I recognized the tone from Vanessa's professional life, the voice she used when delivering bad news to colleagues or subordinates. Marcus looked equally uncomfortable, suggesting that they'd discussed more than just my alleged manipulation of their housing situation. What kind of conversation? I asked, though I suspected I already knew what was coming. The kind where we acknowledge that the current arrangement isn't sustainable, Marcus said, his lawyer's training evident in how he framed the discussion. You're running out of money, Mom. The monthly contributions you've been making are draining your resources faster than you can replace them. Something has to change. The something that had to change was obviously my financial support, but they were approaching the topic with the careful language of people who didn't want to appear ungrateful while still protecting their own interests. The conversation I'd been dreading for months was finally happening, but from their initiative rather than mine. I've been managing the expenses I can handle, I said, not wanting to admit the full extent of my financial strain while they were still treating me like a potential threat to their security. Retirement budgeting requires adjustments, but I'm committed to helping family. Elena, you're not helping anyone by bankrupting yourself, Vanessa said, though her concern seemed more practical than emotional. When your money runs out, and it will run out soon, we'll all be in a worse position than if we made changes now. The logic was unassailable, but the presentation felt cold and calculating. They were concerned about the sustainability of my contributions, not the impact on my well-being or future security. What changes do you have in mind? I asked, though I was already anticipating answers I didn't want to hear. Marcus and Vanessa exchanged a look that suggested they'd rehearsed this part of the conversation, planning their approach and coordinating their arguments before confronting me with their conclusions. "We think you should move back to your own place," Marcus said, the words delivered quickly as if speed would reduce their impact. "Find an apartment or a small house that fits your actual budget, something you can afford on Social Security without depleting your remaining savings." The suggestion landed with the force of physical violence, a rejection so complete and unexpected that it took my breath away. They weren't just asking me to reduce my financial contributions, they were asking me to leave the house I'd helped them purchase, abandon the living situation I'd entered at their invitation, remove myself from their daily lives entirely. "You want me to move out," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. "You want me to find my own housing while you keep the house I helped you buy." "It's not about wanting," Vanessa said quickly. "It's about facing reality. You can't afford to live here and contribute to household expenses." "We can't afford to support you financially when your resources are gone. The only sustainable solution is for everyone to live within their actual means." The phrase "support you financially" was particularly offensive, implying that I was a burden on their resources rather than the primary reason they could afford their current lifestyle. They'd rewritten our financial history in a way that made them the generous ones and me the dependent one, despite all evidence to the contrary. "I see," I said quietly, pieces of a larger picture finally coming together. "So, when my money runs out, I become a liability rather than family. When I can't contribute to your expenses anymore, I need to find somewhere else to live." "That's not fair," Marcus protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "This isn't about punishment or rejection. It's about practical solutions to a financial problem that affects all of us." "Practical solutions," I repeated, tasting the bitter flavor of their pragmatism. "Like keeping the house I helped you buy while asking me to find somewhere else I can afford. Like maintaining the lifestyle I've supported while eliminating the person who made it possible." The conversation had revealed the true nature of our relationship more clearly than months of daily interaction. I was valued for my financial contributions, but not for my presence. Welcomed as a resource, but not as family. Appreciated for what I could provide, but not for who I was. "Elena, you're being dramatic," Vanessa said, but her voice suggested she was beginning to recognize how their proposal sounded when stated directly. "We're not eliminating anyone. We're suggesting that everyone live in housing they can actually afford." "Housing I can actually afford," I said, the irony sharp enough to cut glass. "After spending my housing money on your housing. After depleting my savings to maintain your comfort. After sacrificing my financial security for your dreams." The conversation had revealed the true nature of our relationship more clearly than months of daily interaction. I was valued for my financial contributions, but not for my presence. Welcomed as a resource, but not as family. Appreciated for what I could provide, but not for who I was. "Elena, you're being dramatic," Vanessa said, but her voice suggested she was beginning to recognize how their proposal sounded when stated directly. "We're not eliminating anyone. We're suggesting that everyone live in housing they can actually afford." "Housing I can actually afford," I said, the irony sharp enough to cut glass. "After spending my housing money on your housing. After depleting my savings to maintain your comfort. After sacrificing my financial security for your dreams." The silence that followed was heavy with recognition of truths they'd been avoiding. Marcus looked genuinely uncomfortable now, perhaps beginning to understand the full implications of what they were asking me to do. But Vanessa maintained her defensive posture, committed to a position she couldn't abandon without admitting the callousness of their approach. "We didn't ask you to spend your retirement money on us," she said finally, the words revealing more about her character than she probably intended. "Those were your choices, your decisions to contribute more than you could afford. We can't be responsible for the consequences of your financial management." The statement was breathtaking in its selfishness, a complete abdication of any responsibility for the lifestyle they'd been living at my expense. According to Vanessa's logic, my generosity had been a form of poor judgment, and their acceptance of my contributions carried no obligation or gratitude. "You're right," I said, surprising them both with my agreement. They were my choices. My choice to help family. My choice to prioritize your happiness over my security. My choice to believe that love was more important than money. I paused, letting the weight of those choices settle between us before continuing. And now I get to make another choice. The words carried implications I hadn't fully considered until I spoke them. But once they were out, I realized they represented something I'd been moving toward for days without acknowledging it consciously. The conversation had clarified something important about our relationship and their expectations, and that clarity demanded a response. "What choice?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he was afraid of the answer. "The choice to stop enabling a lifestyle you can't afford and expectations you haven't earned. The choice to protect my own future instead of subsidizing yours." I stood up from the chair I'd never actually sat in, straightening my shoulders with a dignity I'd been gradually surrendering over the past year. The room felt different now, less like my home and more like a place I was visiting, somewhere I'd been welcomed conditionally and could leave when those conditions changed. "Elena, don't do anything rash," Vanessa said, but her voice carried more concern for their financial situation than for my well-being. "We can work this out. We can find a solution that works for everyone." "We just did," I replied, walking toward the stairs that led to my small bedroom. "You want me to move out and live within my means. That's exactly what I'm going to do." But as I climbed those stairs, I was already planning something they hadn't considered. Something that would change the balance of power between us in ways they couldn't imagine. The choice I'd mentioned was bigger than just moving out, bigger than just withdrawing my financial support, bigger than they could possibly anticipate. They wanted practical solutions? I was about to give them one they'd never forget. The following morning brought the kind of autumn clarity that makes everything appear sharp and precisely defined. I woke before dawn, not from the alarm clock, but from the kind of energized alertness that comes when important decisions crystallize into concrete action plans. While Marcus and Vanessa slept in their comfortable bedroom, I sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and began writing lists that would change all our lives. The first list was simple: people to call. David Chen topped the page, followed by Patricia Williams, the real estate attorney I'd worked with when Richard and I bought our first house, and the financial advisor who'd been managing what remained of my retirement accounts. Each name represented a piece of the plan that had formed during a sleepless night of careful thinking. The second list was more complex: assets and liabilities, contributions and obligations, legal rights and practical realities. The house on Maple Grove Drive existed because of my $62,000 down payment. The mortgage payments were manageable because I covered utilities, groceries, insurance, and maintenance costs. The lifestyle Marcus and Vanessa enjoyed was sustainable only because I subsidized it with resources they couldn't replace. But there was something else, something I'd never considered until Vanessa's accusation about investment and returns had planted the seed of possibility. The house I'd helped purchase might be titled in their names, but the equity I'd created through my contributions represented value that could be claimed through legal channels I'd never thought to explore. My phone rang while I was reviewing my calculations, the caller ID showing Patricia's number. Even after retirement, my oldest friend maintained her early morning schedule, calling before 7 with the confidence of someone who knew I'd be awake and available for conversation. "Elena, honey, I've been thinking about our conversation last week. You sounded so strained, and I've been worried about you." Patricia's voice carried the kind of genuine concern that reminded me how much I'd missed having people in my life who cared about my well-being rather than my financial contributions. "Actually, Patricia, I'm glad you called. I need some advice, and I need it from someone who understands legal complications." The request surprised us both, but Patricia had spent 30 years handling complex family disputes and property settlements. If anyone could help me understand my options, it would be someone who'd seen similar situations from every possible angle. What kind of legal complications? Patricia's professional interest was immediately engaged, her voice shifting to the focused attention she'd always brought to challenging cases. I explained the situation carefully, describing the financial arrangements, the living situation, and the previous day's confrontation without editorializing or seeking sympathy. The facts were damning enough without emotional interpretation, and Patricia's legal training would allow her to see implications I might miss. The silence that followed my explanation was long enough to make me wonder if we'd been disconnected. But then Patricia's voice returned with a sharpness I remembered from her courtroom days. "Elena, you need professional legal advice, and you need it immediately. What you're describing isn't just family generosity gone wrong, it's a potentially recoverable financial situation with legal remedies you probably haven't considered." The phrase "potentially recoverable" sent electricity through my chest. I'd been thinking of my contributions as irretrievable gifts, money sacrificed for family happiness, without any possibility of return. But Patricia's response suggested there might be legal frameworks for addressing situations like mine. "What do you mean by recoverable?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would involve complexities I wasn't prepared to handle. "I mean that someone who provides the down payment for a house purchase, continues to pay significant ongoing expenses, and maintains the property through their contributions may have legitimate claims to equity regardless of whose name appears on the deed." Patricia's explanation was delivered in the careful language of someone who understood the difference between general principles and specific legal advice. "But their names are on the mortgage, on the deed, on all the official documents," I protested, though hope was beginning to bloom in my chest despite my practical objections. "Names on documents matter, but so do financial contributions and the circumstances under which those contributions were made. Elena, you need to talk to a property attorney who can review your situation and explain your actual legal options." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Patricia providing names of attorneys who specialized in family property disputes and explaining concepts like constructive trusts and unjust enrichment that I'd never heard of but might apply to my situation. When we hung up, I felt simultaneously overwhelmed by the complexity of legal action and energized by the possibility that I had more power than I'd realized. The sound of movement upstairs indicated that Marcus and Vanessa were beginning their morning routines, but instead of starting breakfast preparations, I remained at the kitchen table with my lists and legal pad. Today would be different from all the previous mornings of domestic service and unacknowledged contribution. When Marcus appeared in the kitchen expecting coffee and breakfast, he found me sitting calmly at the table with my notebook open and my phone within easy reach. His expression moved quickly through confusion, concern, and something that might have been recognition that our established routine had been disrupted. "Morning, Mom. Everything okay? You look like you're planning something." His tone was cautious, suggesting that our previous day's conversation had left him uncertain about my intentions and reactions. "I am planning something," I confirmed, making no move toward the coffee maker or breakfast preparations. "I'm planning to take your advice about living within my means and making practical decisions about unsustainable financial arrangements." The words were delivered with calm precision, but Marcus's face went pale as he processed their implications. He'd participated in telling me to move out and reduce my contributions, but he was beginning to realize that my compliance might look different from what he'd anticipated. "What does that mean exactly?" he asked, though his tone suggested he was afraid of the answer. "It means I'm calling David Chen this morning to express my interest in his client's offer. It means I'm meeting with a property attorney to discuss my legal rights regarding the house I helped purchase. It means I'm taking control of my financial situation instead of letting other people make decisions that affect my future." The explanation was delivered matter-of-factly, but its impact was immediate and dramatic. Marcus sank into the chair across from me, his face cycling through emotions as he processed what I'd said. Behind him, Vanessa appeared in the doorway, clearly having overheard enough of our conversation to understand that something significant was happening. "You can't do that," Vanessa said immediately, her voice rising with panic. "Elena, you can't sell our house out from under us. That's not legal. That's not fair." "I'm not selling your house," I replied calmly. I'm exploring my legal rights regarding the house I helped purchase with my money, maintain with my contributions, and improve with my investments. There's a difference. What legal rights? Marcus asked, his lawyer's training finally engaging with the situation. Mom, your name isn't on any of the ownership documents. You don't have legal standing to make decisions about property you don't own. The statement revealed his assumption that legal ownership was simple and absolute, determined entirely by whose names appeared on official documents. But Patricia's explanation had introduced me to concepts that suggested property rights might be more complex than deed registrations. That's exactly what I'm going to find out, I said, reaching for my phone. I have an appointment this afternoon with Jennifer Morrison at Morrison & Associates. She specializes in family property disputes and constructive trust cases. The name Morrison carried weight in Millbrook legal circles, and Marcus recognized it immediately. Jennifer Morrison had a reputation for aggressive advocacy and successful outcomes in complex property settlements. If I was meeting with her, the situation had moved beyond family negotiations into serious legal territory. "Elena, this is insane," Vanessa said, but her voice carried fear rather than anger. "You're talking about destroying our family over money. This isn't who you are." "You're right," I agreed, surprising her with my ready acceptance of her observation. The person I was would never have considered legal action against family. The person I was would have continued depleting her resources to support people who saw her as a burden rather than a blessing. I paused, letting the truth of that statement settle between us before continuing. But that person was being taken advantage of by people who valued her money more than her presence. "We never excluded you," Marcus protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "You're part of this family, part of this household." "Part of this household as long as I pay my share," I corrected. "Part of this family as long as I'm useful and undemanding. But when I can't afford to contribute anymore, suddenly I need to find my own housing and live within my means." The accuracy of my summary was confirmed by their inability to contradict it directly. Marcus looked genuinely uncomfortable, perhaps beginning to understand how their financial arrangements had affected me, while Vanessa maintained her defensive posture but seemed less certain of her position. "What do you want from us?" Vanessa asked finally, the question revealing that she was beginning to think in terms of negotiation rather than outright rejection of my concerns. "I want what every retirement-aged person wants," I said simply. "Financial security for my remaining years, housing I can afford, and relationships based on love rather than financial obligation." "But you have those things here," Marcus said, though he seemed to realize the weakness of his argument even as he made it. "You have housing, you have family, you have security." "I have housing as long as I pay for the privilege of living in space I helped purchase but don't control. I have family relationships defined by financial contribution rather than emotional connection. I have security that depends on depleting resources I can't replace." The morning light streaming through the kitchen windows highlighted the worn edges of the room I'd been maintaining for over a year, the space where I'd prepared countless meals, managed countless details, and absorbed countless small slights and larger disappointments. It felt different now, like a place I was visiting rather than inhabiting. "Jennifer Morrison's office is downtown," I said, standing up from the table with my lists and legal pad. "My appointment is at 2 o'clock. After that meeting, I'll have a better understanding of my options and my rights." "Elena, please," Vanessa said, her voice carrying a desperation I'd never heard before. "Don't do anything irreversible. We can work this out. We can find a solution that doesn't involve lawyers and legal action." "We had that opportunity yesterday," I replied, walking toward the stairs. "When you suggested I move out and live within my means, you made it clear that our current arrangement isn't sustainable. I'm simply taking your advice and finding practical solutions." "That's not what we meant," Marcus called after me, but his protest sounded weak even to his own ears. "Yes, it is," I said, pausing at the bottom of the stairs. "You meant that when my money runs out, I become a liability rather than an asset. You meant that my value to this family is financial rather than personal. You meant that I should quietly disappear when I can no longer contribute to your lifestyle." The silence that followed was heavy with recognition of truths they'd revealed but hadn't intended to acknowledge so directly. I continued up the stairs to my small room, leaving them to contemplate the consequences of treating someone's love as a renewable resource. My bedroom felt different that morning, less like a sanctuary and more like a staging area for the next phase of my life. The photographs on my dresser, the clothes in my closet, the books on my nightstand all represented a temporary arrangement that was about to become permanent in ways Marcus and Vanessa hadn't anticipated. The phone call to David Chen was brief and professional. Yes, I was interested in learning more about his client's offer. Yes, I understood they wanted to close quickly. Yes, I would be available to meet with them as soon as arrangements could be made. His surprise at my call was evident, but his professionalism prevented him from asking questions about my change of heart since our previous conversation. The call to Jennifer Morrison's office was more complex, requiring explanation of my situation and the legal concepts I wanted to explore. The receptionist was familiar with constructive trust cases and scheduled an immediate consultation, recognizing the urgency of property disputes that involved family members and significant financial contributions. By 10 o'clock that morning, I had appointments that would determine whether my contributions to the house on Maple Grove Drive could be legally recovered, whether Marcus and Vanessa's assumptions about ownership were as absolute as they believed, and whether the balance of power in our relationship could fundamentally alter. The rest of the morning passed in strange suspension, with Marcus and Vanessa moving through their usual routines while maintaining careful distance from me. They spoke to each other in whispers, conducted phone conversations in rooms where I couldn't overhear, and generally behaved like people planning responses to a crisis they didn't fully understand. I spent the time organizing documents I'd need for my legal consultation, gathering records of financial contributions, bank statements, credit card bills, and receipts for major expenses I'd covered during our shared living arrangement. The evidence of my investment in their lifestyle was extensive and well documented, creating a paper trail that would be difficult to dispute or dismiss. As I prepared to leave for my appointment with Jennifer Morrison, Vanessa appeared in the doorway of my room with an expression that mixed desperation with something that might have been genuine remorse. "Elena, I know yesterday's conversation got heated, and maybe we said things that came out wrong," she began, her voice carrying a conciliatory tone I'd rarely heard from her. "But destroying our family over financial disagreements seems so extreme. Can't we find another way to handle this?" The appeal was calculated but not entirely insincere, suggesting that she was beginning to understand the seriousness of the situation and the potential consequences of legal action. But her framing of my response as destroying our family revealed that she still didn't grasp how her own behavior had contributed to our current crisis. "Vanessa, I'm not destroying anything," I said, gathering my documents into a briefcase that had belonged to Richard. "I'm protecting what's left of my financial future after spending everything I had on people who saw my generosity as obligation rather than gift." "We do appreciate everything you've done," she insisted, though her tone suggested she was testing arguments rather than expressing genuine emotion. "We know you've sacrificed for us, and we're grateful, but legal action seems like such a nuclear option." "Nuclear options become necessary when conventional solutions have been exhausted," I replied, thinking of Patricia's advice and Jennifer Morrison's reputation for aggressive advocacy. "Yesterday, you told me to move out and live within my means. Today, I'm exploring how to make that possible." The conversation was interrupted by Marcus calling from downstairs, his voice tight with stress and urgency. "Elena, David Chen is here. He says you wanted to meet about his client's offer." The timing was perfect, though I hadn't planned it that way. David's arrival would demonstrate to Marcus and Vanessa that my legal consultation wasn't my only option, that there were multiple paths forward that didn't require their permission or cooperation. I left Vanessa standing in my doorway and went downstairs to meet with the man who might hold the key to recovering my investment and securing my independence, all in one decisive transaction. David Chen stood in the living room with the confident posture of someone accustomed to significant real estate transactions, his briefcase suggesting he'd come prepared for serious business rather than preliminary discussions. Marcus hovered nearby with the anxious energy of someone watching events spiral beyond his control, while Vanessa had positioned herself where she could hear everything without appearing to be part of the conversation. "Mrs. Rodriguez, thank you for calling. I have to admit, I was surprised by your interest, especially after our previous conversation suggested the family wasn't considering selling. Circumstances change, and people reassess their priorities, I replied, accepting his handshake with the firmness I'd learned from watching Richard conduct business. I understand your client is prepared to make an immediate offer. They are indeed. In fact, they're more interested now than when I first called. The market analysis I've done since then suggests this property is even more valuable than we initially estimated. David opened his briefcase and withdrew a folder thick with documents and comparable sales data. Marcus stepped closer, his face pale, as he realized that David's presence represented a real threat to their housing security rather than the theoretical possibility we'd discussed previously. David, I think there's been some misunderstanding. Elena isn't in a position to make decisions about selling this house. David's eyebrows rose slightly as he processed Marcus's objection, his expression shifting to the careful neutrality of someone navigating unexpected family dynamics. I see. Mrs. Rodriguez, perhaps we should clarify the ownership situation before proceeding with specific offer details. I think that's exactly what we need to clarify, I said, meeting David's questioning gaze directly. The ownership situation is more complex than it appears on paper, and I believe your client deserves to understand all the relevant factors before making an offer. Marcus opened his mouth to protest, but I continued before he could interrupt. David, I provided the $62,000 down payment that made this purchase possible. I've contributed approximately $80,000 in ongoing expenses, improvements, and mortgage support over the past 2 years. While my name doesn't appear on the deed, my financial investment in this property is substantial and well documented. David's expression shifted to the focused attention of someone recognizing a potentially complicated but profitable situation. Real estate attorneys dealt with ownership disputes regularly, and he understood immediately that my financial contributions might create legal complications that could work in his client's favor. That does complicate things, he said carefully, glancing between Marcus and me. Has there been any formal agreement about the nature of these contributions? Any documentation of loans, investments, or equity arrangements? No formal agreements, I admitted, watching Marcus's face go even paler as he realized where this conversation was heading. The contributions were made as family assistance, but circumstances have changed, and I'm now exploring my legal options for recovery. Vanessa stepped fully into the room, abandoning any pretense of staying out of the conversation. Elena, you can't seriously be suggesting that you own part of our house because you helped with expenses. That's not how property ownership works. Actually, Mrs. King, it can be exactly how property ownership works under certain circumstances. Constructive trusts, unjust enrichment claims, and contribution-based equity interests are all recognized legal concepts in situations like this. The legal terminology hit Marcus like physical blows, each phrase representing potential threats to the housing security they'd taken for granted. His legal training was sufficient to recognize the concepts David mentioned, but family law and property disputes weren't his specialty, leaving him uncertain about the strength of any claims I might have. My client is prepared to pay cash and close within 15 days, David continued, sensing an opportunity in the family tension. If there are ownership complications that need resolution, a quick sale with equitable distribution might benefit everyone involved. How much are they offering? I asked, ignoring the shocked expressions on Marcus and Vanessa's faces. The question wasn't about greed, it was about understanding whether David's client represented a realistic path to recovering my investment and securing my independence. David opened his folder and withdrew a single sheet of paper with official letterhead and precise formatting. $425,000 cash with a 15-day closing period and no inspection contingencies. The number hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Marcus and Vanessa had purchased the house for $310,000, meaning David's client was offering over $100,000 above their purchase price. After paying off the existing mortgage, there would be substantial equity to distribute, potentially enough to return my entire investment while providing them with significant profit. "That's impossible," Vanessa said, but her voice carried disbelief rather than certainty. "Houses in this neighborhood don't sell for that much. The market hasn't appreciated that dramatically in 2 years. The market for houses in this specific location with these particular features has appreciated significantly," David explained, withdrawing additional documents that supported his client's offer. "Your property backs up to protected wetlands, has mature landscaping, and sits on a larger lot than most comparable homes. My client is relocating from California, where these prices are considered reasonable for this quality of housing." Marcus sank into the nearest chair as the financial implications became clear. The offer represented more money than he and Vanessa had ever seen at one time. Enough to pay off all their debts with substantial funds remaining for purchasing something more appropriate to their actual income level. "We're not selling," Vanessa said firmly, though her voice lacked the conviction of her words. "This is our home, our neighborhood, our life. We can't just abandon everything because someone waves money at us. Vanessa, you told me yesterday that I needed to move out and live within my means. This offer represents a way for all of us to live within our actual means while recovering the investments we've made in this property." "Your investments," Marcus said quietly, his legal mind finally engaging with the situation's complexity. "Mom, if you pursue legal action claiming equity in this house, it could force a sale, even if we don't want to sell. Partition actions can compel property sales when co-owners disagree about disposition." The admission revealed that he understood my legal position better than he'd initially indicated, and that his objections were based on emotion rather than law. If my contributions created legally recognizable interests in the property, then my rights as an equity holder could potentially override their preferences as title holders. "I don't want to force anything," I said honestly. "I want to recover my investment and secure my own housing for the future. If we can accomplish that through voluntary sale and equitable distribution, that's preferable to litigation and court-ordered partition." David sensed that the family dynamics were shifting in favor of his client's interests. "Mrs. Rodriguez, if you're seriously considering this offer, I should mention that my client is also interested in purchasing the property furnished. They're prepared to pay an additional $15,000 for furniture, appliances, and household items if the current owners are willing to include them." The furniture and appliances David mentioned represented thousands of dollars in purchases I'd made over the past 2 years. Items selected and paid for during my efforts to make the house comfortable and attractive. The additional $15,000 would nearly complete the recovery of my total investment in the property and its contents. "We haven't agreed to anything," Vanessa said desperately, but her protest sounded more like pleading.
"David, we appreciate your client's interest, but we need time to consider our options and discuss this as a family." "Of course," David replied smoothly. "However, my client's offer is contingent on quick acceptance and closing. They're looking at other properties in the area, and this opportunity won't remain available indefinitely." The pressure tactic was subtle but effective, creating urgency that favored immediate decision-making over prolonged deliberation. Marcus and Vanessa exchanged looks that conveyed volumes of unspoken communication, their expressions cycling through panic, resignation, and calculation. "How long can your client wait for an answer?" Marcus asked, his lawyer's instincts finally engaging with the practical aspects of the negotiation. 72 hours, David replied. "They need to make alternative arrangements if this property isn't available, so they can't wait longer than that for a definitive response." The timeline was tight enough to prevent extensive consultation with attorneys or financial advisors, but long enough to feel reasonable rather than coercive. It also created a deadline that would force Marcus and Vanessa to confront the reality of their situation without the luxury of indefinite delay. "I'll need to discuss this with my attorney," I said, gathering my documents and preparing to leave for my appointment with Jennifer Morrison. "David, thank you for bringing this opportunity to our attention. I'll be in touch within the time frame your client specified." "Elena, wait," Marcus called as I headed toward the door. "We need to talk about this as a family before anyone makes commitments or speaks with attorneys." I paused in the doorway, looking back at the son I'd raised and loved, the daughter-in-law I'd tried to welcome, and the living room I'd helped them furnish with my contributions and sacrifices. The space felt different now, less like home and more like a business transaction that needed resolution. Marcus, we've been talking about this for 2 years. Every time I've written a check, made a contribution, or covered an expense you couldn't afford, I said quietly. The conversation is finished. Now we're moving into action. The drive to Jennifer Morrison's office took me through downtown Millbrook, past buildings where I'd worked for decades, and restaurants where Richard and I had celebrated anniversaries and achievements. The familiar landscape felt like a review of the life I'd built before everything changed, a reminder of the person I'd been before I'd become someone whose value was measured in financial contributions. Jennifer Morrison's office occupied the top floor of a restored Victorian building, with tall windows that overlooked the courthouse where Patricia and I had spent our careers. The receptionist who greeted me was professional but warm, clearly accustomed to clients in emotional distress over family property disputes. Jennifer herself was younger than I'd expected, but carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd handled complex cases successfully. Her office walls displayed diplomas from prestigious law schools and photographs with judges and legal colleagues, suggesting expertise that commanded respect in courtroom settings. Mrs. Rodriguez, I understand you're dealing with a family property dispute involving substantial financial contributions, she began, settling behind her desk with a legal pad and pen ready for note-taking. Please tell me about your situation in as much detail as you can provide. I explained everything, from the initial down payment through the ongoing monthly contributions, the recent confrontation with Marcus and Vanessa, and David Chen's offer from his California client. Jennifer listened without interruption, occasionally making notes or asking for clarification about specific financial amounts or timelines. Based on what you've described, you have several potential legal avenues for recovering your investment, she said finally, her tone carrying the authority of professional expertise. Constructive trust claims, unjust enrichment actions, and contribution-based equity interests are all viable theories for your situation. The legal terminology that had intimidated Marcus and Vanessa sounded like hope when explained by someone who understood how to pursue them effectively. Jennifer outlined each option, explaining the evidence required, the potential outcomes, and the likelihood of success based on her experience with similar cases. However, she continued, litigation is expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally draining for families. If your son and daughter-in-law are willing to cooperate with an equitable resolution, that's generally preferable to court action. What would an equitable resolution look like? I asked, thinking of David's client and their $425,000 offer. Ideally, sale of the property with distribution based on each party's contribution to its purchase and maintenance, Jennifer replied. You provided the down payment and substantial ongoing support, while they've been responsible for mortgage payments and basic ownership obligations. A fair distribution might allocate 60 to 70% of the net proceeds to you, with the remainder going to them. The calculation was more favorable than I dared hope, potentially returning not just my initial investment, but a proportional share of the appreciation that had occurred since the purchase. Combined with David's client's above-market offer, an equitable distribution could provide me with enough capital to purchase my own housing while leaving Marcus and Vanessa with sufficient funds to buy something within their actual means. What if they refuse to cooperate? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Then we file a partition action, asking the court to order sale of the property and distribution of proceeds according to each party's equitable interest, Jennifer said, matter-of-factly. It's more expensive and takes longer, but the outcome would likely be similar to what I described for voluntary resolution. The consultation continued for another hour, with Jennifer explaining the legal process, potential timelines, and costs associated with different approaches to resolving my situation. When I left her office, I carried documents that formalized my legal representation and a strategy that would protect my interests regardless of Marcus and Vanessa's cooperation. The drive home took me past the small apartment complex where Patricia lived, a well-maintained community designed for active retirees who wanted independence without the burden of homeownership.
Marcus and Vanessa were waiting when I returned to the house, their expressions suggesting they'd spent the afternoon in intense discussion about David's offer and my legal consultation. The living room had been rearranged slightly, with chairs positioned to facilitate conversation rather than confrontation, a small gesture that suggested they were prepared to negotiate rather than simply resist my position. "How did your meeting go?" Marcus asked, though his tone indicated he was afraid of the answer. "Very well," I replied, settling into the chair they'd obviously intended for me. "Jennifer Morrison believes I have strong legal claims for equity recovery, whether through voluntary agreement or court action." "Elena, we've been talking," Vanessa began, her voice carrying a conciliatory tone I'd rarely heard from her. "We realized that our conversation yesterday came across as ungrateful and dismissive of everything you've done for us. We didn't mean to make you feel unwelcome or unappreciated." The apology was carefully worded but felt genuine, suggesting they'd spent the afternoon recognizing how their behavior had contributed to our current crisis. However, words were easier than actions, and I'd learned to judge intentions by outcomes rather than promises. "I appreciate that," I said simply, waiting for them to explain what changes they were willing to make beyond verbal acknowledgments of past mistakes. "We want to find a solution that works for everyone," Marcus continued, "something that recognizes your contributions while allowing us to keep our home and maintain some stability in our lives." "What kind of solution did you have in mind?" I asked, genuinely curious about what they considered fair under the circumstances. They exchanged glances before Vanessa spoke. "We could formalize your equity interest in the house through a legal agreement."
Document your contributions and establish your ownership percentage so you'd have security and a claim on appreciation when we eventually sell. The proposal was more reasonable than I'd expected, but it still assumed that my primary goal was securing future returns rather than immediate recovery of my investment. It also required me to continue living in their home under arrangements that had already proven unsustainable for my emotional and financial well-being. "That's thoughtful," I said carefully, "but it doesn't address my immediate needs for independent housing and financial liquidity. A future claim on appreciation doesn't help me afford my own place now." "We could refinance," Marcus suggested, his voice gaining enthusiasm as he developed the idea. "Take cash out based on the property's appreciation and use that to repay your contributions. You'd have your money back, and we'd keep the house with a higher mortgage payment." The refinancing proposal was more attractive but still problematic. It assumed they could qualify for a larger mortgage without my income being counted as household support, and it required me to continue living with them while they adjusted to higher housing costs. Most importantly, it didn't address the fundamental relationship issues that had created our current conflict. "Marcus, these solutions assume I want to continue living here under the same arrangements that led to yesterday's confrontation," I said honestly. "The problem isn't just financial. It's about respect, independence, and having relationships based on love rather than financial obligation." The statement created uncomfortable silence as they processed what I'd said. They'd been focusing on monetary solutions while ignoring the emotional dynamics that had made our living situation untenable for me. "What would make you feel respected and independent?" Vanessa asked, though her tone suggested she was afraid of the answer. "Owning my own home, managing my own finances, and having relationships with family members who value my presence rather than just my contributions," I replied. "David's client offers a path to all of those things through immediate sale and equitable distribution of proceeds." "But that means we lose our home," Marcus said, his voice carrying genuine distress. "Elena, this house represents everything we've worked toward: our first real home, our investment in the future, our sense of stability and belonging in the community." The emotional appeal was powerful, and I felt genuine sympathy for their attachment to the home I'd helped them purchase. But their sense of stability had been built on my financial instability. Their belonging had been subsidized by my sacrifice, and their future had been secured by depleting mine. "Marcus, I understand this house means a lot to you," I said gently. "It means a lot to me, too, because I invested everything I had in making it possible.
But loving something doesn't automatically create the right to keep it at someone else's expense. The conversation continued for another hour, with various proposals and counteroffers that all seemed to assume I would continue prioritizing their preferences over my own needs. They offered higher percentages of future appreciation, formal documentation of my contributions, and even a small monthly payment to acknowledge my ongoing investment in their housing costs. Each proposal missed the fundamental point that I needed immediate recovery of my investment and independent housing, not continued entanglement in their financial decisions. By evening, we'd reached an impasse that highlighted the gap between their desire to maintain their lifestyle and my need to secure my own future. "I'm calling David tomorrow morning," I announced finally, gathering the documents I'd been reviewing during our discussion. $425,000 represents fair market value for this property, and equitable distribution would allow all of us to move forward independently. "Elena, please don't do this," Vanessa pleaded, but her appeal lacked the angry desperation of her earlier protests. "Give us more time to find alternatives. Maybe we can get a loan, or ask family members for help, or find some other way to raise the money you need." "You had 2 years to find alternatives while I was depleting my resources to support your lifestyle," I replied, not unkindly but without compromise. "David's client has given us 72 hours to respond to their offer. That's more time than most people get to make life-changing financial decisions." I spent that evening organizing my belongings and planning for outcomes that had seemed impossible a week earlier. The small bedroom that had represented temporary family assistance would soon be vacated, whether through my voluntary departure or court-ordered property sale. Either way, the living arrangement that had diminished my dignity while depleting my resources was ending. The next morning brought the clarity that comes with irreversible decisions. I called David Chen at exactly 9 o'clock and accepted his client's offer on behalf of all parties with ownership interests in the property. The conversation was brief and professional, focused on timelines and procedures rather than family drama or emotional complications. Marcus and Vanessa received the news with resigned acceptance rather than outrage, perhaps finally understanding that their alternatives to voluntary sale were limited and less favorable than cooperation. The legal documents were prepared quickly, with Jennifer Morrison representing my interests and David handling the transaction details for his client. The closing took place 2 weeks later in a conference room downtown, with cashier's checks and signature pages that transformed my family relationships into business transactions. The equitable distribution awarded me $285,000 from the sale proceeds, enough to purchase my own home with money remaining for comfortable retirement living. Marcus and Vanessa received the remainder, approximately $125,000 after paying off their mortgage and covering transaction costs. It was enough for them to purchase a smaller home that matched their actual income level while eliminating their dependence on my contributions. 3 months later, I was settled into a charming cottage near the lake, 10 minutes from downtown Millbrook, but in a completely different world from Maple Grove Drive. The house was small but perfectly sized for one person, with a garden where I could grow vegetables and flowers without asking anyone's permission. Marcus called occasionally, our conversations careful but gradually warming as we rebuilt our relationship on foundations of mutual respect rather than financial obligation. Vanessa sent a Christmas card that included a brief note acknowledging that the sale had been the right decision for everyone involved, though our relationship remained politely distant. Patricia visited frequently, delighted to have her old friend back in her own space and social circle. The book club welcomed me back with genuine warmth, and I discovered that retirement could be fulfilling when it wasn't compromised by other people's financial emergencies. The cottage's front porch faced west, catching sunset light that painted everything golden and peaceful. On quiet evenings, I sat there with a cup of tea and my library book, listening to birds settle into trees and feeling grateful for the courage to reclaim my life when it seemed like all options had been exhausted. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I'd continued enabling their lifestyle until my resources were completely gone, if I'd accepted the role of grateful dependent they'd carved out for me. But those thoughts never lasted long, displaced by the satisfaction of owning my own space, managing my own finances, and having relationships based on choice rather than necessity. The house on Maple Grove Drive was sold to people who could afford it without sacrifice or subsidy. My cottage by the lake was purchased with money I'd recovered through legal action and personal courage. The difference represented more than real estate transactions. It represented the transformation from someone who gave everything away to someone who understood her own worth. David Chen's client had provided more than a generous offer. They'd provided the catalyst for changes that secured my independence and restored my dignity. Marcus and Vanessa received more than money from the sale. They'd received the opportunity to build a sustainable lifestyle within their actual means. And I had received what every person deserves in their retirement years: a home that belonged entirely to me, relationships based on love rather than financial obligation, and the peace that comes from finally understanding the difference between generosity and enablement. The sunset painted my porch golden as another peaceful day ended in the life I'd built from the ashes of expectations that had nearly consumed me. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, new choices, and the continuing joy of living entirely within my own means while owing nothing to anyone except gratitude for the strength to save myself when no one else could. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.